Good morning. Welcome to I'll call this meeting the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. Committee, there's an agenda. We'll start with a prayer. Mr. O'Reilly, please rise.
I don't have it with me.
Can you ad-lib?
Sure. Thanks. We are here today to serve the people of the Northwest Territories. We want to remember those that are at home in our communities, and that we want them to be safe, and we will do our best to make the best decisions possible for the people that we serve. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly, please be seated. There's an agenda before us. Committee, are there any additions or deletions? Seeing none, can I get a motion to move the agenda? Mr. Simpson, all in favor? Thank you, committee. Declarations of conflict of interest. Hearing none, we'll move into today's committee business, public clause-by-clause review of Bill 26, Statistics Act, with the Honourable Robert McLeod, Minister of Finance. I'll just proceed with some opening comments, and then we'll commence with the clause-by-clause review. Welcome to this public meeting. To begin, we'll introduce committee members and staff. Mr. Simpson.
R.J. Simpson, MLA from Hay River North.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
And welcome, Herb Neckermack from the Neckwood.
And with me I'm Kieran Testard, member for Cam Lake and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. With me at the table are Jennifer Frankie-Smith, committee clerk, April Taylor, committee research advisor, and Alyssa Holland, law clerk with the Legislative Assembly. Today, the Standing Committee on Government Operations is holding a public clause-by-clause review of Bill 26 Statistics Act. There are copies of the bill available at the back of the room. Bill 26, sponsored by the Minister of Finance, establishes the framework to allow the Northwest Territories Bureau of Statistics to collect, analyze, disseminate, and share information. The information is used for making informed decisions. Bill 26 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on October 29, 2018, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Government Operations for review. The Standing Committee on Government Operations sent letters inviting input from an extensive list of stakeholders, including all municipal and Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories and a number of non-governmental organizations. The committee received a submission from Ms. Elaine Keenan-Banks, the Northwest Territories Information and Privacy Commissioner, who expressed support for a number of important provisions in the bill. The Commissioner did, however, express some reservations about Section 12 of the bill, which authorizes the Bureau of Statistics on behalf of the government to enter into agreements with organizations other than Statistics Canada, including the government of another province or territory, a municipality, an Indigenous government, a corporation, or any other organization for the purposes of collecting, sharing, and tabulating information. Bill 26 will have paramountcy over the Territory's access to information and protection of privacy legislation. For this reason, committee feels it is important to include privacy protections related to the sharing of information under Section 12 of the bill. Committee will therefore be moving a motion today to amend Bill 26 to include such provisions. With similar considerations related to privacy, committee will also be introducing a motion that compels the territorial statistician to notify the respondent if their personal information is disclosed in an unauthorized manner, and requiring the minister to report annually to the Legislative Assembly the total number of unauthorized disclosures. Committee will be moving a motion to provide for a nominal fine of $200 for a person who commits an offense under subsection 14 of the Act, which prohibits someone from declining to comply with the territorial statistician's request for information. Finally, committee will also be moving a motion that corrects a typographical error in the text of the bill. I will now invite the Honourable Minister of Finance to introduce himself and his staff for the record and proceed with any opening comments that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no opening comments. Just thank the committee again for their time in the work that we've done on this particular piece of legislation. I'll just do a staff introduction. I have with me Mr. David Stewart. Secretary to the Financial Management Board, I have Vishni Puris as Territorial Statistician, and Mr. Ian Rennie is Department of Justice, and in the back we have Laura Jeffries, who's also with the Department of Justice, as well as my Ministerial Special Advisor, Mr. Rob Collinson.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Committee, does committee have any questions for the minister? Does committee agree to commence the clause-by-clause review of Bill 26 Statistics Act? Thank you, committee. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 17 clauses in the bill. Please turn to page 1. To clause 1, does committee agree? To clause 2, does committee agree? Clause 3, does committee agree?
Agreed.
To clause 4, does committee agree?
Agreed.
To clause 5, does committee agree?
Agreed.
To clause 6, does committee agree? Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 26 be amended in the English version of subclause 6.2 by striking out Statutory Instrument Act and substituting Statutory Instruments Act. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The motion's in order. To the motion. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. This is just correcting a spelling mistake. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
I do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Committee, to clause 6 is amended. Does committee agree? To clause 7, does committee agree?
Agreed.
To clause 8, does committee agree?
Agreed.
To clause 9, does committee agree? Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 26 be amended by adding the following after subclause 9.3. 4, if the territorial statistician becomes aware of a disclosure of information not authorized by this act, the statistician shall notify the respondent from whom the information was obtained of the disclosure within a reasonable time. 5, if the minister shall cause a copy of a written report, or rather, 5, the minister shall cause a copy of a written report indicating the total number of unauthorized disclosures in a fiscal year to be tabled before the Legislative Assembly not more than 90 days after the end of the fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The motion's in order. To the motion. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. This is a mandatory breach notification provision similar to the one found in the Health Information Act. And from everything that we've heard from the Department of Health, they've found that provision useful. If a breach is not, if there's no notification, it often goes, people aren't aware of it. And if you're not aware of it, you can't fix the problem. And so what Health has done is from these notifications, they've incorporated that into their training, and it solved a lot of the issues. So I think this will go a long way to ensuring people's privacy. And there's also an annual reporting component so that the public is aware of what's going on in terms of breaches. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. To clause 9 as amended, does the committee agree? Thank you. To clause 10, does the committee agree? Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 26 be amended, A, in subclause 9.1 by striking out and section 10 and substituting and sections 10 and 10.1, and B, by adding the following after the heading agreements and immediately before section 11. 10.1, an agreement entered into under section 11 or 12 must include conditions satisfactory to the minister with respect to the following. A, the security and confidentiality of identifying information. B, the removal or destruction of information of individual identifiers at the earliest reasonable time. C, restrictions on the manner in which identifying information may be subsequently used or disclosed, including requirements respecting respondents' consent to subsequent use or disclosure where appropriate. D, the prohibition, where appropriate, of any subsequent use or disclosure of identifying information without the express authorization of the minister. E, the particulars of ownership, copyright, and rights to use information that will be retained, conveyed, or exercisable by each party. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The motion's in order. To the motion. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. Because this bill will have paramountcy over the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, we felt that this clause should be included to protect people's privacy. And in particular, I'll draw your attention to subsection E, which means that the government must turn their mind to the ownership and copyright of certain pieces of information. And this is derived from the model used in Nunavut. And this particular subsection E is to protect the rights of organizations who agreements are entered into with, particularly First Nations organizations, Indigenous organizations. We wanted to make sure that they were confident that their information would be protected and it wouldn't be usurped by the government. And I think that in this day of reconciliation, this is a good clause. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
No, Mr. Chair, I don't, and I'll have Mr. Stewart read out.
Mr. Stewart, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So there's two elements to the motion that caused some concern. The first is having this apply to the agreements with Statistics Canada. There is a strong national statistical system where part of the strength of the bill is to be able to share data between the two organizations, and some of the elements here would be very difficult to implement with Statistics Canada. The second element relates to Clause E of the proposed amendment, and that's around the particulars of ownership, copyright rights of information or use of information, and when we share with other parties. The issue with this is that there's been a strong relationship established between the Bureau of Statistics and Indigenous governments in the North, probably over 20 years or so, maybe even longer. The Bureau works very closely with them. In fact, there's been 2 Indigenous governments that actually have funded the GNWT for positions to help them with data gathering and et cetera. The issue around trying to lay out or require specifics around ownership and copyright, that's a very contentious issue in southern Canada with Indigenous governments. It has led to where governments won't participate in surveys by provincial governments and the federal governments over a long period of time. It's not that these issues don't need to be addressed, but by forcing them into legislation, we think that it will actually offend the Indigenous governments, because we've had such a strong partnership approach in the past that to have to enter into the discussions right off the bat around ownership and copyright and possession. In fact, even the recent Aboriginal People Survey, that's had implications, and we don't think it's required in the legislation. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. The minister does not concur, so the amendment will not take effect as a result. Committee to Clause 10. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move another motion. This one is essentially the same, but it removes provision E. And so I guess it's the trust us.
Mr. Simpson,
Yeah.
can you read the motion?
I just have to read the motion
Yeah,
first?
I'll allow you to speak to it. Go ahead.
You think it was my first day, eh? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 26 be amended in subclause 9.1 by striking out "and" Section 10 and substituting "and" Sections 10 and 10.1, and B by adding the following after the heading "Agreements" and immediately before Clause 11. 10.1, an agreement entered into under Section 12 must include conditions satisfactory to the minister with respect to the following: A, the security and confidentiality of identifying information; B, the removal or destruction of individual identifiers at the earliest reasonable time; C, restrictions on the manner in which identifying information may be subsequently used or disclosed, including requirements respecting respondents' consent to subsequent use or disclosure where appropriate; D, the prohibition where appropriate of any subsequent use or disclosure of identifying information without the express authorization of the minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Motion's in order. To the motion. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was saying, this is essentially the same as the last motion I moved, but it takes out subsection E, which the government has concerns with. So Nothing further, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, committee, for that brief indulgence. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. To clause 10 as amended, does committee agree? Thank you, committee. To clause 11, does committee agree? To clause 12, does committee agree? To clause 13, does committee agree? Clause 14, Mr. Simpson.
Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 26 be amended by renumbering Clause 14 as Subclause 14.1 and adding the following after that renumbered subclause. 2. A respondent who commits an offense under subsection 1 is liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding $200. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Motion's in order to the motion. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an amendment to do two things. One is to make the document more readable. The bill as proposed doesn't specify penalty, which means that we must look at a different act to figure out what the penalty is, and from that act we have to go to a different act from a different jurisdiction, which would be the Criminal Code of Canada. And from there we see that the penalty would be, I think it's $5,000 and up to 6 months in jail are the maximum penalties, and we think that's a little excessive and a little confusing. So I am recommending the fine be not exceeding $200. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Committee, to clause 14 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. To clause 15, does committee agree? To clause 16, does committee agree? To clause 17, does committee agree? We'll now return to the bill number and title, Bill 26 Statistics Act. Does committee agree? Does committee agree that Bill 26 Statistics Act is now ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the Bill 26 Statistics Act be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in the Committee of the Whole as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. To the motion?
Question?
Mr. Simpson, your motion is actually not in order. I'll allow the clerk to speak to you. We'd like to try again. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 26 Statistics Act be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. The motion is now in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 26 Statistics Act will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you, Minister. Thank you to your officials, and thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. Minister, do you have any closing comments?
Just thank committee again for their time and their work on this, and we'll get it ready for debate in Committee of the Whole. But appreciate committee's time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. We are now adjourned.